Hi guys, so let's now take a look at MEDCs and globalization, the benefits as well as the costs of the process of globalization on more economically developed countries. Okay, so first up we can see that Western multinational corporations have really been able to actually increase their size quite considerably. It's opened up new markets where we can then sell the goods produced by these multinational corporations in those markets. What's more, it's also enabled greater volumes of those products, of course, to be made, and that enables more economies of scale to be exploited. Further to this, it means that you can also exploit the lower cost factors of production which exist overseas and exploit the comparative advantages of different countries. So if you take an example such as Dyson, perhaps Dyson's research facility and product development site is still based in Wiltshire in the UK, but yet all of their production takes place in the Far East. Now that enables Dyson to get the best of both worlds and to enjoy the different comparative advantages which actually exist in those two different economies. Okay, this of course enables more jobs to be created in the UK and higher value added jobs as well. Okay. Now, if we then have a look at the lower prices that globalization has enabled consumers to benefit from, it's another interesting argument in favour of globalization. Lower prices for not just final products, but also the inputs of those manufactured goods means that you will see lower prices overall, and of course that is massively beneficial. It means consumers have more choice, it means that they have greater consumer surplus because the prices are lower, and there is therefore increased economic welfare and improved living standards as well. So if we just consider this on a demand and supply diagram here, you can see I've put down the price of consumer goods and the quantity of consumer goods on our axes there. We've got the domestic supply that's capable of being produced and the domestic level of demand there as well highlighted. So if we now consider the scenario of actually engaging in international trade, well, we can then actually think about what sort of impact this might have on the given circumstances we can see here. Okay, so let's just put in the supply curve for the world. Now, it's perfectly elastic because we're considering that there's many different economies that can produce these given goods, and therefore we can choose where to actually import these goods from. Okay, so thus we are really considering that there is a perfectly elastic supply curve. Now, if we now just separate each of these areas, so we'll call that A, B, C, D, and E, okay, we can then have a look at the producer and consumer surplus before and after globalization. Well, as a direct consequence of this, we can see the producer surplus would be areas B and C. Okay, so we'd have B plus C. The consumer surplus would just be A prior to actually engaging in global trade. After global trade, though, of course, well, what can we notice here? Well, the producer surplus has actually been reduced to just C. Okay, so we can see now we are actually going to import more goods from abroad and less goods are going to be made domestically. So we've got Q2 and Q3. So between areas Q2 and Q3, there will be a rise in the actual volume of imports that takes place here. So this quantity along our axes reflects the actual level of imports that we see there. Okay, so as a direct consequence, however, we can see that the price is reduced, and the overall point where supply equals demand is, of course, right out here now at Q3. Okay, so these consumers who previously couldn't afford to buy those products which were domestically produced, well, they can now get their hands on those products, and that increases consumer surplus further. So now we can see that actually the consumer surplus is A, B, D and E It's all of that area. So look at that massive increase in economic welfare. It really is considerable there. Okay, now there is, of course, a downside to all of this, and that is the fact that we have seen reduced domestic production from Q1 to Q2. So reduced domestic production has taken place from Q1 to Q2. Now, this is going to require, in certain areas where these perhaps manufacturing industries were based, well, it's going to require what's known as structural adjustment. And this is where the structure of the regional economy will need to actually adapt and change as the industries that are relevant to our economy change, really, because we know that comparative advantage will change as a country develops, and countries must therefore be ready to adapt. They must be agile in their outlook. It's no coincidence, of course, that agility rhymes with stability, and therefore economies need to make sure that they can make those adjustments, that they can be agile, that they can be dynamic and actually look to the future and accept that in a globalised world, well, this is the sort of scenario which is likely to play out. Of course, the alternative is that we start taxing those imports from the rest of the world. Now, that could attract retaliation. It could break down against WTO rules. And really, it's almost like delaying the inevitable, because these firms from Q1 to Q2 are less competitive because their supply costs are higher after all. Okay, so this structural adjustment, though, it is painful. It really is painful. If you look at specific areas where this adjustment has taken place, some of those areas have barely adjusted. Take, for instance, the South Wales mining communities and the valleys there. Even though the coal industry was shut down long ago, those economies have really faltered and really struggled to get back up on their feet. So it's caused not just a generational decline in that area, but an intergenerational decline. And that is, it's extremely painful. There's no two ways around that. So we see in that area high unemployment, and we see a lot of negative externalities. So for instance, there's a lot of incidents of depression and the need for prescriptions of antidepressants and so on. So there's a lot of negative social externalities that have come about as a result of this structural adjustment. If you think about it, though, really what should happen is as the prices of land in a particular area become cheaper, then really what should take place is something more dynamic in the economy, and investment go into those areas. But it doesn't necessarily work like that, okay? And this, of course, has resulted in rising income inequality, and there is an excellent graph known as the elephant graph, and you can look that up, which actually depicts how in MEDCs lower skilled and unskilled workers have really lost out as a direct consequence of globalisation. So there is also